Good afternoon, Valeriy Viktorovich.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, dear viewers, audio listeners, and comrades in the studio. Today is February 17th, 2025. In the previous episode of Question Answer, the main topic was dedicated to the meeting of the leaders of the three countries of the anti-Hitler coalition, the USSR, the USA, and the United Kingdom in Yalta at the so-called Yalta Conference, which took place 80 years ago. And in connection with this, Georgie sent us the following comment. Valeriy Viktorovich, were the rules any different before the Yalta Conference? They were exactly the same. Russia was being targeted for destruction during the foreign intervention, just as it was during Hitler's invasion. What has changed? Only that more destructive types of weapons have appeared. But that has been the case throughout all of human history, ever since the Stone Axe.
Yes, watching and seeing are two different things. And failing to see the difference between the Westphalian system of international relations and the Yalta system is, in general, a commonplace occurrence not only among ordinary people, but also among political scientists, political oafs, and even politicians tend to view it narrowly, focusing only on technologies. And when you ask them to explain, why was it necessary to rename the system if the principles remained the same as those formulated under the Westphalian system? Why was it necessary to build an entirely new framework? The response you hear is, well, it was yet another redivision of the world. But, excuse me, there have been many redivisions of the world.
Разница между Вестфальской системой мировых вот этих вот отношений, международных отношений, и Ялтинской системой можно лишь только тогда, когда понимаешь, что такое государство.
Understanding the difference between the Westphalian system of international relations and the Yalta system is possible only when one understands what a state is, what national and supranational governance are, how an empire differs from a state, and how the process of globalization unfolds on planet Earth. The process of globalization consists of the concentration of governance over the planet's productive forces. This process cannot be prohibited or canceled. It is objective. However, the governance of this objective process is subjective. The way it unfolds is determined specifically in pivotal historical epochs. So why was the Westphalian system suddenly abolished and replaced by the Yalta system? To answer this, we must first understand what the Westphalian system of international relations and the Yalta system actually represent. We all know that the Westphalian system emerged as a result of the so-called 30 Years' War, when the Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire signed an agreement with diverse states. However, these are not fully fledged states in the modern sense. They were imperialist states. Some were state-like entities, others were city-states, and some were religious. In other words, the imperialist states varied in nature. So what? Why did a decision made essentially within the Holy Roman Empire suddenly establish an international system? Had there been no wars or treaties before that? Of course, there had been.
До Вестфальской, вот этого Вестфальского мира, заключенного в
Before the Peace of Westphalia was signed in 1648, there had been numerous wars, and these wars were indeed long-lasting.
вот сама вот
The
эта
30
война,
Years' War
она
itself
десятилетняя,
lasted
но
3
ее
decades, but
мы
some historians place it within a
более
broader
длинной
cycle,
считал,
linking it to the
80-летняя
80
война,
Years' War that
проходившую в
took place in
Европе.
Europe.
А ведь перед этим были и другие войны, в том числе и Столетняя война, которая вот вообще длилась 116 лет.
And even before that, there were other wars, including the 100 Years' War, which actually lasted 116 years, and treaties were also concluded as a result of that war. But why did they not establish an international system?
Более того, в 1494 году между Португалией и Испанией был заключен так называемый
Moreover, in 1494, Portugal and Spain signed the so-called Treaty of Tordesillas, by which they divided spheres of influence across the entire planet Earth and defined the framework of their relations. This treaty was approved by Pope Julius II. One might think that the issue of international relations had been settled once and for all. Yet, nearly 200 years later, the question arose again.
Если посмотреть на то, что последовало за Вестфальским миром, разве принципы, которые были...
And if we look at what followed the Peace of Westphalia, can we really say that the principles proclaimed in these peace treaties, which marked the beginning of the Westphalian system of international relations, were never violated?
Ведь, смотрите, да, приоритет национальных интересов, но это государство.
After all, consider this. Yes, the primacy of national interests, which applies to states, the principle of balance of power, the priority of nation-states, the principle of state sovereignty, the right to demand non-interference in internal affairs, the equality of states, and the obligation to uphold signed treaties. All of these principles seemingly continue to apply.
Разве мы не видим международную практику того, что эти все принципы...
But haven't we seen, throughout the entire history of humanity, that in international practice, all these principles have been repeatedly violated? They were violated even after the Peace of Westphalia was signed, laying the foundation for the Westphalian system of international relations.
Всего лишь через 40 лет после того, как состоялось это утверждение этих правил, разразилась так называемая девятилетняя война, которую некоторые историки называют войной, Первой мировой войной, поскольку
Just 40 years after these rules were established, the so-called 9 Years' War broke out, which some historians consider the First World War, since nearly all state entities of the time participated, and fighting extended to North America and India, earning it the designation of a world war. Then came the Great Northern War, which resulted in the emergence of the Russian Empire. There were also the War of the Spanish Succession, the War of the Austrian Succession, and the 7 Years' War, which Churchill called the First World War, followed by the French Revolution and the Revolutionary Wars, and then the rise of the French Empire and the Imperial Wars of Napoleon I.
То есть было во всей истории человечества проявлено то, что принципы, оглашенные в Вестфальской системе, они как бы
So, throughout human history, it has been revealed that the principles outlined in the Westphalian system serve mostly as guidelines, but they never actually changed the international system. Everyone simply continued to act according to their own will.
Есть определенный спор. Кто определяет, что Вестфальская система действовала
In this regard, there is a specific debate. Some argue that the Westphalian system remained in effect until 1814 to 1815, when Napoleon was finally overthrown, while others believe it lasted until the First World War, setting different boundaries for its duration. But even if we accept that the Westphalian system remained in effect until the First World War, that means the world existed within some kind of new system of relations before the formation of the Yalta system of international relations. So what actually happened?
Имели все основания для того, чтобы на основании этих заключенных договоров между...
After all, in all the wars I have listed, there were plenty of reasons to establish a new system of international relations based on the treaties concluded among different states as a result of these wars. States were divided, and new borders were drawn, just as they were in the Yalta Agreement and the Peace of Westphalia. By the way, in the Westphalian settlement, borders hardly shifted at all. Yet, they shifted significantly during the 9 Years' War, the 7 Years' War, and especially the Great Northern War, which led to the emergence of the Russian Empire. The emergence of the Russian Empire was a highly significant transformation that should have been formally recognized as shaping the global system of international relations. Yet for some reason it was not.
Выполняла второстепенную роль, и с ней не считались, даже при том, что Россия это...
Well, we have repeatedly discussed how, before the revolution, Russia played a secondary role and was not taken seriously, even though it had become an empire that no one in the world could ignore. Yet, until the October Revolution of 1917, all supranational forces simply exploited Russia, using it for their own interests.
Как, например, это произошло в Отечественную войну 1812 года, когда в интересах России не было...
This is exactly what happened during the Patriotic War of 1812, when, in Russia's interests, there was no need to destroy Napoleon, while in Britain's interests, Russia had to fight against Napoleon. Alexander I did just that, fighting against Napoleon and bringing the country to the brink of state collapse. It was left to Nicholas I to rescue the state from complete catastrophe.
Так вот, что же тогда по сути является вот это вот Вестфальское и...
So then, what exactly are the Westphalian and Yalta systems at their core?
Вот для полного понимания у нас есть трехтомник «Война, государство, большевизм». Там прописано...
For a complete understanding, we have the 3-volume work War, State, Bolshevism, which explains everything. What a state is what national and supranational governance are, the special type of state known as an empire, the methods of waging wars, and the way out of the ongoing cataclysm.
Вот не понимая эти процессы,
without understanding the processes described in these books, it is very difficult to grasp the depth of these processes. If, after the Peace of Westphalia, whose exact end is unknown, as there is much debate on this, we continuously observe repeated violations of its principles, then we should ask ourselves several questions. If these treaties established a specific world order, but within the framework of the Holy Roman Empire, then why should they be universal for everyone? Who is supposed to follow them? And if they followed them, why did they do so? And if they truly followed them, then why were the Westphalian system's core principles, such as state sovereignty, respect for national interests, diplomacy, and others, constantly violated? Why did the world undergo constant redivision? He answers to these questions reveal that the Westphalian system defines something other than these formal parameters, which were repeatedly violated. That's why, failing to understand this, some argue it ended in 1814 to 1815, while others claim it lasted until 1914. But if it ended in 1914, what came after it? And if it really ceased to exist, then how does it differ from the Yalta system of international relations? It's actually quite simple. This is about the principles of globalization on planet Earth.
Глобализация на планете Земля пока не состоялась.
Until the emergence of a great state, the number one superpower, the USSR, globalization followed an exclusively Western model. As stated in the Bible, you shall rule over many nations, but they shall not rule over you. In Russia, however, globalization was carried out according to the principles of the Russian world, where people were friends, comrades, and brothers to one another. The nations integrated into the empire were granted equal rights and opportunities, not only to preserve their national cultures, but also to develop them. This fundamental difference between the two civilizational approaches must always be kept in mind when discussing the Westphalian system of international relations and the Yalta system.
Если мы посмотрим на Европу до середины XIX века, даже до конца XIX века, то мы увидим лоскутные одеяла.
If we look at Europe up until the mid-19th century, or even the late 19th century, we see a patchwork of a vast number of states.
Когда осуществляется управление по принципу силы, когда ты будешь господствовать над кем-то, то
when governance is based on the principle of force, you shall rule over others. The borders of a state are determined by the tip of the sword, reaching only as far as the power of one ruler or another extends. This is precisely why European states were, and still are, relatively small. Russia, on the other hand, by uniting peoples based on the principle and idea of a shared future, has built and continues to build a state on a different foundation, one that does not suppress its nations but preserves and develops them. So, until 1917, Russia remained largely unnoticed on the global stage. Meanwhile, Europe was constantly shaken by wars, both before and after the Peace of Westphalia. But what was the essence of these wars? The essence of these wars was the seizure of resources. As stated in the book War, war is a set of measures aimed at seizing foreign energy, natural and human resources. This definition comes from the conception of public safety. Therefore, if you seek to acquire as many resources as possible, you must first accumulate forces before attacking your neighbor and plundering them. In other words, the entire Western world operated on the principle, rob your neighbor, or else your neighbor will rob you first, and rejoice in it. And so, they constantly waged wars time and again. Why were the principles of a new world order proclaimed after the 30 Years' War? The reason is that the 30 Years' War led to a sharp decline in the population. For example, in southern Germany, only a third of the population survived the 30 Years' War. As a result, various clan corporate groupings lost their incentive to continue fighting because there was nothing left to fight over. That is, if you don't have the opportunity to get any resources, then waging war is pointless for you.
Вот этим кланово-корпоративным группировкам нужно было обеспечить то, чтобы была всегда
These clan
возможность
corporate groupings needed to ensure that there was always a certain level of resource stability.
какие-то взаимоотношения,
They had to establish some form of relationship among themselves to prevent the complete depletion of resource potential. This way, in the event that one state absorbed another, it could still seize its resources.
Образно говоря, глобализация того времени шла по одному
Figuratively
простому
speaking, the
принципу,
globalization of
который
that time
известен
followed
у
a
нас с
simple
90-х
principle,
годов
one that has been well known in
и
Russia since the
широко представлен в
1990s and
кинематографе:
widely depicted in
войны
cinema:
между
gang
бандами.
wars.
Когда банды начинают делить территорию, они понимают простую вещь, что если сейчас они
When
будут
gangs
играть
begin
вот
dividing
так по
territory, they
беспределу,
eventually realize a
это что
simple
называется,
truth.
красные пришли
If they
играли,
continue
белые пришли
looting
играли, да,
recklessly, the
бедному
Reds come
крестьянину
and loot,
бодаться,
the Whites
то
come and
не
loot. Where's a
останется
poor peasant to go?
того
Then soon there will
потенциала,
be no
который
future
можно
potential for
грабить.
plunder.
И тогда банды для сохранения своего ресурсного потенциала вынуждены договариваться между собой о том, как строить отношения
To preserve their
между
resource
собой, между
potential,
конкурирующими
gangs are
бандами.
forced to
И
negotiate
как
among themselves,
выстраивать
how to structure their
отношения по
relationships with one another, among
отношению
rival
тем
gangs, and
ресурсам,
regulate the
которые они
resources they
эксплуатируют.
exploit.
При этом банды
At the same time, gangs
редко
rarely
сливаются
merge
в
into a
одну.
single entity.
Они по-прежнему сохраняют конфронтационный потенциал. Они по-прежнему при первой же возможности
They
готовы
maintain their
вцепиться друг другу
confrontation
в
potential
глотку
and remain
и
ready to tear
воевать
each
за
other apart at the
территорию
first opportunity
той
to
банды,
seize the
против
territory
которой
of a
они
competing gang.
выступают. То же самое и произошло, когда был
The same
заключен
situation
Вестфальский
occurred when the
мир.
Peace of Westphalia was signed. It
И
was
именно
built on
на
these
этих
very
принципах,
principles.
когда нужно было
It was
выстроить
necessary to
определенные
establish
отношения,
certain relationships
реально
among
между
what were
бандитскими
essentially gang-like
группировками,
groupings in a way
так,
that ensured the
чтобы
sustainability
был
of their resource
потенциал
potential,
ресурсный, на
which they
котором
relied
они
on for
живут.
survival.
И никуда желание перегрызть друг другу глотки,
However,
оно не
the desire to tear each other
делось.
apart never disappeared.
Оно
It remained
сохранялось.
intact.
И это было
This was a conceptual
концептуальное
unity
единство по
based on the
принципу
principle:
«И будет
you shall
Господь
rule
над
over
одним
many
народом, а они
nations,
над
but
тобой
they shall not
господствовать не
rule
будут».
over you.
Они выстроили именно эту систему
They constructed
взаимоотношений.
precisely this system of
Ничего
relationships,
ей не
and nothing opposed
противодействует.
it.
Почему было выстроено по
Why was this
Вестфальскому
system
миру?
established through the
Неужели
Peace of
нельзя было
Westphalia?
выстроить вот
Couldn't it have been
эту
created,
систему
for
вот
example,
после, например,
after the Hundred
Столетней
Years'
войны,
War? A
которая,
war that,
кстати,
by the
шла
way,
этапами? А
unfolded in
почему она шла
stages.
этапами?
And
Вот
why
мы
did it
тут
unfold in
рассуждаем
stages?
о том, что каждые 100 лет
We often discuss
объединенная
how, every
Европа
100 years,
собирается
a
все
united
вместе
Europe
и
gathers
идут
to
на
march
Россию
against
войной,
Russia, only to
чтобы
receive from
получить
Russia
от России
exactly what it deserves in
заслуги.
return.
То есть каждой Европе для того, чтобы пойти
That is,
войной
before
на
waging
Россию,
war on Russia,
требуется
Europe requires a
столетний
century-long
подготовительный
preparatory
период.
period.
Так и со Столетней войной. Для того, чтобы провести ее в 3 этапа, вынуждены были делать перерывы для того,
The
чтобы
same was true for the Hundred Years' War. To conduct it in 3 stages, pauses were necessary, allowing a new generation to grow up, economic life to recover, and military potential to be financially supported, which could then be used for future wars. And there were extremely serious wars taking place.
Вот и перед той же Вестфальской системой, например, война Алой и Белой
For
Розы,
example, before the Westphalian system was established, the wars of the Red and White Roses in England nearly wiped out the entire governance corps, the nobility. As a result, England was forced to transition to the gentry system, effectively replenishing the noble corps to maintain governance.
Вот в этих условиях они все более и более приближалась необходимость выверить, как, чтобы
In these conditions, the need to refine the way relationships were managed became increasingly urgent to prevent clan corporate wars from leading to complete self-destruction.
И суть, почему именно только в середине 17 века, в 1648 году, это стало зафиксировано в римском.
The reason this was only formally codified in the mid-17th century, specifically in 1648, within the Holy Roman Empire through treaties among imperial estates, and why it became a model for international relations, lies in the following. All previous wars have been fought within the framework of a still dissolving clan tribal society.
То есть, фактически, общество феодальное.
In other words, while societies had become feudal, warfare was still conducted according to the concept of tribal society, based on tribal principles.
А почему? А потому что технологически.
Why? Because technological limitations dictated this approach.
Но уже во время Столетней войны появляется артиллерия.
However, during the Hundred Years' War, artillery had emerged, bringing a qualitative change to warfare.
И к 17 веку способы ведения войны стали вполне соответствовать тому, той социальной организации общества.
By the 17th century, warfare had finally aligned with the social systems of European nations.
Но новые способы ведения войны, новые вооружения привели.
But this new warfare, along with advanced weaponry, led to unreasonably high civilian casualties, destroying the very resources wars were fought over.
То есть тебе ни хлеба, ни других
This meant no
продуктов,
bread,
ни
no
промышленных,
goods,
ремесленных
no
изделий,
industrial or artisanal
ничего нет,
products.
потому что
Nothing, because these
эти
wars were
войны
still waged
уничтожали
according to the
еще по
destructive
принципу
logic of clan
многоплеменного
tribal
общества.
society.
Именно поэтому войну в той же Южной Германии там
This
наибольшие
is why
потери
in southern Germany,
произошли,
where civilian
мирного
casualties were the
населения,
highest,
пережило всего
only a
треть
third of the
населения.
population
А
survived.
вообще там было
These losses were
с
further compounded by
эпидемиями,
epidemics
с
and
голодом,
famine.
естественно.
Naturally,
Вот, потери
the
были
casualties were
очень
immense.
И вот эта Вестфальская система мирных, международных взаимоотношений, она выработала принцип
Thus, the Westphalian system of
взаимоотношений
international relations established the principles of relationships
по
among,
концепции
related through a shared
управления
governance conception,
социальных
social systems.
организаций. И потому-то она, вне зависимости от того, что постоянно
And that is
велись
why,
войны,
despite continuous
прожила
wars,
до
the
октября
Westphalian system lasted until October 1917.
Если кому-то угодно, пусть до
If someone
1914
prefers,
года.
they can argue it lasted until 1914. But in this case, a difference of 3 years is insignificant from a purely chronological perspective. However, in terms of understanding governance processes, it is fundamentally important.
Почему? Потому что появилось государство, которое стало проводить иную концепцию глобализации.
Why? Because a state emerged
по-другому
that pursued a
строила
different conception of
отношения,
globalization. It
включая
structured its
в себя
relationships with integrated
объекты.
entities in a fundamentally different way.
И это было более-менее терпимо до того момента, пока строился, так сказать, социализм в отдельно взятой стране, локально,
This was
и
more or
эта
less
страна
tolerated as
находилась
long as
во вражеском
socialism was
окружении за
being built
железным
within a single
занавесом,
country and remained
за
localized,
забором,
while this country was
и
surrounded by hostile
не
forces behind the
оказывала
Iron Curtain,
крупного
fenced off
такого
by them, and not
воздействия
exerting
на
significant influence on
международные
international relations.
отношения.
Because
Потому
at that
что
stage,
Советскому
the Soviet
Союзу
Union was
нужно
focused
было
primarily on
выживать.
survival.
Да, Советский Союз,
Yes, the
Советская
Soviet
Россия
Union,
много
Soviet
работали
Russia,
в
was
глобальном
highly active in
плане
global
глобальной
politics.
политики, и поэтому, создавая
By
определенные
doing
окружения, как,
so, it
например,
created
Турцию,
certain points of tension,
которая
such as
сохранилась
in
до тех пор,
Turkey, which managed to survive within its
параметрах
existing
только благодаря
parameters only thanks to
Советской
Soviet
России,
Russia.
а
The
не то,
Western
как
colonial
они
powers,
ее
on the other
расчленили
hand, had planned to dismantle
западные
it
колонизаторы.
completely. As a
Вот, и
result,
мы им
we
создали вот
created
этот
for them
чемодан
a
без ручки,
suitcase
который и
without a
бросить нести
handle,
тяжело, и
too
бросить
heavy to
шаг.
carry,
Но в результате
yet too
этого мы
valuable to
смогли
abandon.
победить в гражданской и
But through
войне
this
и разоружить
process,
иностранную
we were able to
империю.
win the Civil
Мы
War,
смогли
repel foreign
восстановить
intervention,
территориальную
and
целостность
restore Russia's territorial
России.
integrity.
Пусть не в
While
полной
not
мере, как это было
entirely
в
to the
Российской
extent of the
империи,
Russian
но
Empire, we managed to
в
reclaim a
значительной
significant portion.
степени. В 1945 году для всех стало очевидно, что влияние Советского Союза таково, что
By
он
1945, it had
однозначно
become evident
одним
to everyone
фактом
that the
своего
influence of the Soviet
существования
Union was so
будет
significant that its very
проводить
existence would inevitably lead
свою
to the
концепцию
implementation of its own
глобализации.
conception of
И
globalization.
никуда
There
от
was no
этого не
avoiding
деться.
it.
И поэтому могли бы
Had
западные
Western
лидеры
leaders been
этот
able to
факт
ignore this
проигнорировать,
fact,
они
they
бы
would
не
not have
приехали
come
в
to
Ялту.
Yalta.
Но они прекрасно понимали, что страусиная
But they fully
позиция
understood that an
делать вид,
ostrich
что
strategy,
ничего не
pretending that
произошло,
nothing had
это
changed,
самое
would be the most
глупое, что
foolish course
можно
of action.
сделать. И поэтому они поехали договариваться в Ялту, поехали определять формат взаимоотношений
That is why they went to
с
Yalta to
новым
negotiate, to
субъектом
establish a framework for
проведения
relations with a new actor in global
глобальной
politics,
политики,
a new
субъектом
force in
глобализации
globalization,
на
based on
новых
fundamentally
концептуальных основах.
different
И
conceptual
если
foundations.
Вестфальская система определяла взаимоотношения в одной однородной среде, концептуальной,
If the Westphalian
вот этих
system
плановых
regulated
партийных
relations within a
группировок, то
homogeneous
в данной
conceptual environment
ситуации
among its clan
потребовалось
corporate
выработка
groupings, then, in this
взаимоотношений
new
с
situation,
государством,
it became
которое будет
necessary to
проводить
establish
иную
relations with a state that
концептуальную
pursued a different conceptual
политику.
policy and built
Будет
life
строить
on
жизнь
Earth
по
according
иной
to a different
концепции.
conception.
Потенциала за
The West
гасить
never had the capability
Россию
to
у них
completely destroy
никогда не
Russia.
было.
If they
Иначе они
had,
не
they wouldn't
приходили
have
бы
had to
на
invade
Восток
Russia every 100
и
years,
в Россию,
only
не
to
убирались
retreat and
свояки
defeat each
разбитые.
time.
Вот. А с той Россией-то, которая стремилась следовать в русле Запада, которая сама хотела, чтобы Запад был учителем для
However,
России,
as long
и
as Russia
чтобы
was
не
trying to
нужно
follow the
было
Western path,
иметь какие-то
seeking the
отношения
West as its
и
leader, Western
используя
powers could
потенциал
still engage with
России,
it, using
расправляться
Russia's potential to
с теми,
remove
кто
obstacles
мешает
to their
процессу
own globalization
глобализации, как, например,
process.
это было сделано с Наполеоном,
For instance,
которого,
this is
в принципе,
exactly what
создали
happened
ради
with
одной
Napoleon,
цели,
who was essentially created for one purpose,
чтобы
to
он
destroy
уничтожил
Russia.
Россию. А
But in
уничтожать это,
reality,
в принципе,
what was being
конкурент
destroyed was a
глобализации
rival to Western
Франции,
globalization,
потому что именно
France.
Франция была
Because it
лидером
was France that was the
глобализации
leader
до
of
Великой Французской
globalization before
революции.
the
И
French
только
Revolution.
после Великой Французской
And only after the
революции
French Revolution
Франция
did France
стала
become a
второстепенной
secondary
державой.
power.
Так вот, здесь ситуация принципиальная. Разница
Thus,
между
the difference between the
Вестфальской
Westphalian system of
системой
international
мирных
relations and the Yalta
международных
system
отношений
is
и Ялтинской.
fundamental.
В Вестфальской системе, повторю, выстраивались взаимоотношения между однородными.
To reiterate, in the Westphalian system, relationships were established among homogeneous, conceptually related entities of state governance.
А Ялтинская система, она определила взаимоотношения антагоничных между собой.
The Yalta system, on the other hand, defined relations between two antagonistic systems in terms of their conceptions of globalization.
Понимая, что полная конфронтация между этими двумя
Fully understanding that total confrontation between these two systems would lead to the collapse of civilization on planet Earth, these relations were built accordingly.
И опять же, они даже не собирались каким-то образом скрывать то, что они настроены против России.
And again, the West did not even attempt to hide their hostility toward Russia, nor did they suggest that accepting certain rules would put an end to their anti-Russian activities. No.
Вот так же, как в той Вестфальской системе все государства по-прежнему продолжили конкурировать.
Just like under the Westphalian system, their states continued to compete among themselves, violate treaties whenever convenient, and declare war on one another under any pretext.
Но сам формат взаимоотношений.
However, the very framework of their relationships prevented them from eliminating the resource base that fueled competition among their states. The same applied here. A new system had to be established because a new actor had emerged, one that was conceptually and ideologically entirely antagonistic to the existing actors in the global hierarchy of states, and with which they needed to define the parameters for mutual relations. This is precisely what the Yalta system developed.
Вернуть Советский Союз за железный занавес, что было предпринято уже в 1946 году.
The attempt to push the Soviet Union back behind the Iron Curtain, which was already undertaken in 1946, quickly led the West to realize the failure of such an approach.
Что Советский Союз строит новую систему международных отношений.
They soon understood that the Soviet Union was building a new system of international relations, which was reflected in the emergence of socialist-oriented countries, the formation of the socialist Commonwealth in Europe, and ultimately, the collapse of the colonial system. Of course, they could not accept this. After all, they had always waged war against Russia, as the question correctly pointed out. But that is their conceptual essence, waging wars to enslave others and seize their resources. Just look at the Crusades. Look at the countless wars waged against Russia. In 1854, they launched yet another war against us, the one known in Russia as the Crimean War, but in the West as the Eastern War.
Так вот, выработка новой системы взаимоотношений.
Thus, the development of a new system of relations between conceptually antagonistic systems was the essence of the Yalta agreements.
И когда я говорю, что мы по сути пребываем в системе ялтинских взаимоотношений, это означает
When I say that we are still essentially operating within the Yalta system of relations, it means one simple thing. The disappearance of the Soviet Union from the political arena did not eliminate the system itself.
Сохранился Китай, сохранился Вьетнам, сохранилась Куба, сохранились страны, которые
China remained, Vietnam remained, Cuba remained. The countries that fought for their liberation from colonial rule remained. New states emerged.
И они-то как раз и являются теми государствами, которые в этой ялтинской системе
These very states are the ones that, within the Yalta system, continue to resist the colonialist West, which had established its system of relations for itself and among itself as far back as the Peace of Westphalia in the 17th century. But look, the West still does not operate within the framework of these formally declared principles. These principles are proclaimed as goals, yet the only thing that compels any Western entity to abide by a treaty is the strength of the party with whom they signed it. When the Soviet Union existed, they respected treaties with the Soviet Union. But once the Soviet Union disappeared and Russia began to rise again, the West's resource insufficiency became apparent, particularly in the United States of America. And what happened? Immediately, Trump declared, "We'll take back the Panama Canal. We'll take Canada. We'll take Greenland. We'll deal with Mexico. The entire Western Hemisphere is ours. Stay out of it. We'll handle everyone here ourselves." This essence immediately revealed itself. If they are in constant confrontation and a state of war among themselves over resources, if they have never even adhered to the principles they themselves declared back in the 17th century, then what kind of treatment can Russia expect? To them, Russia has always been nothing more than a resource appendage of the West.
Состоялся Советский Союз, супердержава номер один, которая стала строить альтернативное мировоззрение.
And when the Soviet Union emerged, the number one superpower, building an alternative world order, it became necessary to establish rules for coexistence on planet Earth with this alternative world order. This is what the Yalta system truly represents. The Westphalian system is essentially a set of rules governing the conduct of different gangs operating within the same territory, each occupying its own section.
Ялтинская система – это, если приводить таким вот примером, то когда были кулацкие банды,
The Yalta system, to use a similar analogy, served to prevent kulak gangs from entering certain areas where territorial units were stationed to combat banditry. That is, these gangs needed to negotiate terms of conduct with entities they couldn't currently fight. At the same time, those entities had no immediate interest in waging war against the gangs, either because they were geographically distant, engaged in different activities, or because certain relations provided mutual benefits. That was why the Yalta system was necessary. To reiterate, it is fundamentally different from the Westphalian system. While the Westphalian system operates in a conceptually homogeneous environment, the Yalta system functions between two ideologically antagonistic systems that have developed a way to coexist. And the Yalta system is still alive today because the legacy of the Soviet Union has not disappeared. Even Russia itself is experiencing a revival, and the whole world watches with hope for the resurgence of Russia. As a result, the question of revising international relations naturally arises. That is, the balance of power is already shifting. Whereas the West was once dominant, it is now in a state of significant decline. Moreover, the West now faces a new problem. The very countries it once colonized now have excessive populations relative to their struggling economies. This surplus population harbors one primary aspiration: to relocate to the prosperous West. And the principle is simple. You were our colonizers, and now you are obligated to provide for us. This is precisely what drives the behavior of migrant communities today. But this process is also being deliberately encouraged by the global elites. Why? Because they're shifting the center of governance concentration from Europe to Iran and China. As a result, European states and European nations must be reformatted. Through the influx of new populations, new languages, new peoples, and new states are expected to emerge. One way or another, the task of establishing new principles of international relations between state entities arises to prevent civilization from collapsing on planet Earth. This is exactly what the Yalta system ensured. This is exactly what the Westphalian system ensured, each in accordance with the technological level of societal development of its time. At the time of the Westphalian system, there was a particular level of development, a certain population size, and specific technologies, so international relations had to be structured accordingly to preserve the environment necessary for human existence. Later, new technologies emerged, along with a new global entity that was fundamentally antagonistic to the already existing ones. So new rules for interaction had to be developed. This is what was established. The way state borders were divided and the way the post-war map was drawn play an absolutely secondary role. What truly matters are the dialogues, both those that were transcribed and those that were not. I mean that many dialogues between the leaders were not officially transcribed, that determined the acceptable parameters, what one system could or could not do against the other system. The same was true for the Westphalian treaties. But what about the principles formally established by the Westphalian system? Take, for example, the primacy of nation-states or the principle of state sovereignty. Why not follow them? Let's strive toward that. But how many states actually possess full sovereignty? And is the priority of nation-states truly upheld everywhere? Clearly, there is still a long way to go. These principles serve merely as guiding beacons. That is how this system works. But, I repeat, fully understanding everything I have just explained is only possible if one knows how a state is formed, how an ordinary state differs from an empire, what national and supranational governance are, what conceptual and ideological power is, and much, much more. All of this is thoroughly covered in our 3-volume work, War, State, Bolshevism.
Another question from Stas. On February 12th, Putin had a telephone conversation with his American colleague, Donald Trump. The heads of state paid special attention to resolving the situation in Ukraine and also discussed the Middle East agenda, Iran's nuclear program, and the development of bilateral economic relations. They talked about energy, artificial intelligence, and other topics. Putin invited his American colleague to Moscow, Valeriy Viktorovich. Does this mean that the pro-American lackey elites will finally understand their master has abandoned them, and that the negotiations they were counting on, the signing of Russia's capitulation, as you have repeatedly said, have failed?
No, the pro-American lackey elites won't understand. Their slave mentality dictates that the master is always right. Right now, they're simply in a bit of stupor. Who is the master now? And how are we supposed to build new relationships? So what has happened? Let's briefly analyze the situation with Trump. Right now, Trump is in a great hurry for one simple reason. If he slows down even slightly, he won't have time to accomplish much.
что его противники добиваются того, чтобы
The thing is, his opponents are working to completely disable him, rendering him incapacitated, just as they did during his first term. Yes, Trump has now entered the game at a different level. Yes, he is currently dealing with his opponents, but they, too, have prepared for him.
Дело в том, что в настоящее время администрация Байдена подготовилась к приходу Трампу таким образом, чтобы полностью консолидировать все подпиндосное управление в странах мира.
In anticipation of Trump's return, the Biden administration moved to consolidate all pro-American puppet governments worldwide in order to ensure that they would not shy away, but instead actively work against Trump in support of the very forces that oppose him within the United States. Their thinking remains unchanged. We'll outlast Trump for 4 years, and then everything will go back to how it was.
Как выясняется, сейчас, благодаря деятельности того же Илона Маска по его аудиту различных организаций, в Европу и вообще по всему миру было закачано несколько сот миллиардов
In this context, it has now come to light, thanks to Elon Musk's efforts in auditing various organizations, that several $100 billion were funneled into Europe and across the world through various ministries and organizations. Some estimates even suggest up to $1 trillion was funneled to fund and consolidate all anti-Trump forces in Europe.
Более того, как выяснилось, более миллиарда долларов
Moreover, it has been revealed that the Biden administration allocated over $1 billion to various American NGOs engaged in anti-Trump activities. Trump fully understands that if they consolidate now, if they unite against him as a single, organized front, his governance could collapse. His entire governance is already hanging by a thread. That's why he is pushing forward with such urgency. But we can see it clearly. Europe, which initially wavered slightly when Trump came to power, having expected Kamala Harris instead, has suddenly consolidated and turned against Trump.
Трамп звонит и разговаривает с Путиным, и тут же министры иностранных дел, которых возглавляет Кая Каллас,
Trump calls and speaks with Putin, and immediately afterward, foreign ministers, led by Kaya Kallas, unite to issue a collective ultimatum to Trump. No matter what agreement you sign, we will not allow you to implement it. Therefore, you must take us into account. This is a very strong ultimatum. In other words, anti-Trump forces in Europe still retain considerable control over governance. Yes, their grip is weakening. Yes, Ruda quickly lost his composure, suddenly referring to Putin exclusively as Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin. And there he is, referring to Putin in the Russian tradition. Meanwhile, on all our TV screens, various so-called political oafs, and others refer to him only as Vladimir Putin. Even Zarubin. One would think that, as the host of Moscow, Kremlin, Putin, he of all people should consistently say Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin if he were a truly Russian person. But he is not a Russian person. He is a pro-American lackey. And that's why to him, Putin is just Vladimir. But the most telling example is the behavior of Vladimir Zelensky, this expired U.S. proxy president in Ukraine. The U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, Bessent, arrived in Ukraine with a large team of auditors to inspect the financial activities of the Ukrainian government. Interesting, isn't it? A commission from another state arrives to audit the government's activities. And for Ukraine, this is considered normal. Well, that's because Ukraine is an engineered state. It is not autonomous. It is a failed state. Once again, to understand this, read the 3-volume work, War, State, Bolshevism. But look at the situation. Bessent arrives with a document and says, "Here, sign this agreement, under which you will transfer your natural resources to the United States." Zelensky responds, "Jal, but may I do it in a ceremonial setting? In Munich, in the presence of a U.S. Vice President J.D. Vance. You may." 2 days later, he arrives in Munich. And what does he announce? "I'm not going to sign it." In other words, the behavior of various state figures in Europe, all of them state in name only, is entirely dictated by whoever has most recently given them instructions, pressured them, or made a phone call. So, when speaking with Bessent, Zelensky naturally obeys Trump. But as soon as Bessent leaves, the U.S. national elites who oppose Trump begin working on him, and suddenly, he refuses to sign the agreement to transfer natural resources. But there's something very interesting about these natural resources.
Трамп, говоря о природных ресурсах Украины, сказал, значит,
when discussing Ukraine's natural resources, Trump stated, "We gave Ukraine $177 billion, which means Ukraine's debt is $300 billion. And now it owes us $500 billion. Great economics. And how did he put it? We'd be fools not to take it. But there's one small problem. Ukraine is part of Russia. Yes, for now, it has temporarily broken away from central governance. There is a wild field there, and its gangs are already in the process of being pacified. But nonetheless, it remains part of Russia. Moreover, the majority of its natural resources are already under Russian military control, meaning they cannot simply be taken. And so, Trump contemplates deeply. Ukraine may go back to Russia, or it may not go back to Russia. But what is he really saying? His speech was quite lengthy, yet many, at least I haven't heard any political analysts, fail to truly grasp what Trump was saying.
Понимаете, какая ситуация? Мы тут в войне против России очень сильно поиздержались. Нет, не финансово. Денег у нас достаточно. У одних наличных долларов.
And Trump, when translated into Russian, essentially said the following. You see, here's the situation. We've spent a great deal in this war against Russia. No, not financially. We have plenty of money. There are 6 times the world's total GDP floating around the planet in cash dollars alone, scattered in people's pockets. What we lack are real resources. Russia, do you want this territory, Ukraine, to be yours? Do you want us to hand it over to you? Then you must give us $500 billion worth of natural resources. Only then will the territory of Ukraine be yours. You destroyed it in your war against these Banderian gangs, and you will be the ones to rebuild it. But in return, you must guarantee our resource stability to the tune of $500 billion. Do you think I'm fighting tooth and nail for Greenland or for Canada, just for the sake of it? No, I need resources. As Musk said, money is just a database for exchange of goods and services. He phrased it this way, but in the conception of public safety, the definition is more precise. Money is the most generalized form of information about product exchange. This is exactly the idea Musk conveyed. Money itself means nothing beyond that, but resources do. So, when some say, your Gazprom is nothing, look at Google's market capitalization, and then look at Gazprom's, then the crisis hit. And what happened? Did Google save the West when gas ran out? Or did industries start collapsing? Meanwhile, Gazprom directly sustained Russia. Gas tangibly supports Russia's interests. In other words, real economics always matters, not the artificial, inflated, speculative economy that has been built worldwide to sustain a financial bubble, pumped up by parasitizing the entire world through the issuance of unbacked currency. That's why, for Trump to stay in power and keep his economy running, he needs resources. But he cannot take resources from Ukraine directly. It is crucial for him that Zelensky signs the agreement and hands over Ukraine's resources to the United States.
И тогда на основе этой Филькиной грамоты можно соблюсти какой-то там
Then, with this worthless piece of paper, Philip's letter, they can at least maintain a facade of legitimacy when making claims on some of Russia's resources. In reality, Trump is acting exactly as the foreign interventionists did towards Soviet Russia after the Civil War and foreign intervention.
Они что же сказали? Мы во время интервенции поиздержались, воюя против вас.
Back then, they also said, during the intervention, we incurred significant costs fighting against you. We spent this many shells, this many bullets, suffered these human losses, and so on. We intended to colonize and carve you up, using that to recover our losses and to profit. But since we failed to do so, now you, Soviet Russia, must compensate us for all of it and pay even more so that we still make a profit. Trump is operating under the exact same logic. He demands to be compensated. What did the West get from Soviet Russia? Nothing. Moreover, yes, at that time, the Soviet Union was not yet in a position to fully dictate its will to the West. This allowed the West, to some extent, to seize our Russian island of Grumman, now called Spitsbergen. Later, during his tenure as Russia's presiding resident, installed by the United States, Dmitry Anatolyevich Medvedev even attempted to hand it over to Norway. Yet another attempt to deprive Russia of its resource-rich territory and surrender it to the West. But this is exactly how the pro-American lackey elites operate. They hate Russia. Their sole objective is to lick their master's ass. They are slaves in their mentality, and they simply cannot break free from it. How did Peskov report on Putin's phone conversation with Trump? Listen to it. It's available online, just 2 minutes long.
Он говорит о Трампе исключительно уважительно, как о хозяине, который является субъектом управления, который
He speaks about Trump with absolute reverence, as if he were a master, a true decision-maker, an independent force in governance, one who gives directives while Putin merely agrees, suggests things, and strives to carry out Trump's will. Peskov spoke about Putin in such a demeaning way, yet about Trump with such admiration. Finally, the message was clear. Trump told Putin this, and Putin agreed, while Putin merely mentioned, almost as if we have some interest too. Meanwhile, Trump graciously agreed, and Putin immediately promised to fulfill everything Trump said. Disgusting. Simply disgusting. Once again, Peskov demonstrated an outrageous level of Russophobia. proving himself to be an absolute pro-American lackey. He cannot even conceive of Russia as a sovereign, independent state. Only the will of the master matters to him. And in his comments on Putin's conversation with Trump, he sent a clear message. Don't think Putin is an independent leader. Don't think Russia will act as a truly sovereign state. We will obey the will of our master. The master is different, but he is still American, and so we will serve him. And this was immediately reflected in the key interest rate. Do you think Nabiullina lowered the key interest rate? No. The essence of all this is as follows, returning once again to the Westphalian system of international relations and the Yalta one.
За время, когда Советский Союз разрушен, на Западе в силу абсолютно несубъектной, несуверенной политики россионской элиты, вот этих рабов-подпиндосников, которые высшей целью своей жизни видят только...
Following the dismantling of the Soviet Union, the entire West, enabled by absolutely non-independent, non-sovereign policies of the Rus-Zion elite, these servile, pro-American lackey elites, whose highest aspiration in life is to lick their American master's ass, came to believe that the Yalta system no longer existed, and that Russia was nothing more than an ordinary colony to be looted. As a result, the Western elites continue to speak to Russia with condescension, while the Rus-Zion elite desperately scrambles to serve them.
И то, как сейчас идет уже 3 года, специальная военная операция убеждает Запад в том,
and the way the special military operation for demilitarization and denazification has been conducted over the past 3 years has only reinforced the West's conviction that the Rus-Zion elite would never dare to inflict any real harm on their Western master.
И вот выступает американский сенатор, который объясняет о том, что, почему нужно вот это соглашение. И он говорит, вы понимаете, какая ситуация? Мы сейчас подпишем вот эти соглашения с Зеленским. Мы зайдем на территорию, своими войсками американскими зайдем на территорию...
Then an American senator speaks, explaining why this agreement is necessary. And he says, do you understand the situation? We will sign these agreements with Zelensky, deploy American troops to Ukrainian territory, and that's it. The war is over. Russia will not dare to touch American troops. Russia will concede all the natural resources that Zelensky signs over to us because from that moment on, they will belong to the Americans. And that's it. No more war. We arrived. We are Americans. We control everything.
Вот в передаче Богданова про Америку, которую показали у Куликова в «Воскресном вечере», у Киселева, прошу прощения, в «Воскресном вечере».
In Bogdanov's program about America, which aired on Kiselev's FCT-Altai, there was a segment, perhaps incomplete, but notable nonetheless.
Значит, там телекомпания CBS разговаривает с журналистом, который работает с Украиной. И он говорит, там, на Украине, все
In it, CBS interviewed a journalist who works with Ukraine, and he said, in Ukraine, everyone was thrilled when Trump came to power. They believed that, since he had previously imposed sanctions on Russia, he would now put it in such a position. He would order Russia to stop the war, and they would comply. Ukraine was completely stunned that Trump didn't order Russia to stop the war. On the contrary, he is now demanding that Ukraine take certain actions to appease Russia. This came as a total shock to them.
Но самое главное, о чем там было сказано, на Украине в Европе, в Соединенных Штатах все уверены в том,
But the most important point made was this. In Ukraine, Europe, and the United States, everyone is convinced that the United States is the ultimate global authority. And if the American president gives an order, it must be followed without question. Russia is being punished for defying the U.S. president. But now, with Russia so exhausted and the arrival of a decisive Trump, it has no choice but to submit. And in this regard, the entire pro-American lackey Russ-Zion elite thinks the same way.
У них произошел шок в Европе от того, вот как там сказал Лавров-то, что они были, вот Bloomberg это ошеломлены.
Europe was in shock. Bloomberg reported that they were stunned by Trump's conversation with Putin, while Lavrov described them as being in a state of stupor. I don't recall his exact words, but this captures the essence of what he said. How could this happen? Instead of ordering Putin, instead of continuing to pressure him, Russia was so close to being completely crushed. Look at the Russ-Zion elite. They are all pro-American lackeys, entirely pro-Western, betraying Russia's interests. Nabiullina is dismantling Russia's economy, which is why she has once again been named the world's best banker. Because she follows U.S. directives better than anyone. Because she is systematically destroying Russia for the sake of U.S. interests. And now, suddenly, Trump is negotiating with Putin. Simply due to their own short-sightedness, they failed to grasp what Trump fully understands, what the supranational governance of the world truly realized when it agreed to the Yalta Conference agreements. The subsequent Cold War, which the West launched against Russia, did not lead to Russia's destruction. It resulted in only a single temporary victory in this long war. And as it turns out, that victory did not guarantee ultimate triumph. It merely postponed inevitable defeat. It's much like all the victories the Wehrmacht achieved on its march to Moscow. Yes, for now, we're still striking the West at a level comparable to the Soviet victory outside Moscow. Yes, there is still a long road ahead before securing complete victory over the West. But it is already in sight. The West cannot sustain the production of enough ammunition to continue its war against Russia. Even if they manage to maintain the armed forces of Ukraine at their desired numbers, they simply have nothing left to arm them with. They're emptying their stockpiles. They need a break. And it is precisely this break that all the pro-American lackey elites are now desperately calling for on every television channel. And the West sees it too, how the Russ-Zion elite is eager to surrender Russia, to betray it. And suddenly, Trump is speaking with Putin. But Trump understands one simple fact. While the Russ-Zion elite may be concentrated in state governance, they make up only 1%. And if they continue betraying Russia, history will repeat itself, just as it did in the 17th century, when a militia of Pojarsky and Minin drove out foreign interventionists from Moscow and restored Russia's sovereignty and the independence of the state. And it will happen again, just as in 1917, when the Bolsheviks rebuilt the state and made it the world's #1 superpower. Trump represents the global elites. They want to boil us like a frog, slowly. To do that, they need to prolong the process, reinforce the United States with resources, and maintain conceptual indeterminacy in Russia, symbolized by the double-headed eagle. Symbols carry great meaning. So, if your state emblem is a double-headed eagle, don't expect conceptual determinacy in state policy. You will always find yourself in situations like this. You are at war with Hitler, yet at the same time, you sell him ammunition so he can fight against you. Just as it's happening now, the West is waging war against us, yet we're still supplying them with resources, enabling them to produce shells and bullets that are then used to kill our people, including civilians. Because, after all, it's profitable, it's just business. Never in history have warring states supplied each other with resources. If someone was caught doing this, it was considered treason, and they were executed. But today, it has become the norm. Selling weapons to the enemy? He's called a businessman. Engaging in economic sabotage? Nabiullina is called the world's best banker. In any system, whether Westphalian or Yalta, if a state had even a shred of sovereignty, Nabiullina would have already been executed. Yet instead, she remains the head of the central bank, a so-called respected figure.
Так вот, именно потому, что вся европейская элита надеялась на то,
Precisely because the entire European elite was convinced that Russia was on the verge of collapse, that just a little more pressure would be enough, Trump's sudden pivot to negotiations left them completely stunned.
они не поняли, они стали
They had no idea what was happening and immediately began voicing their anti-Trump stance. I repeat, the anti-Trump forces worked hard to consolidate the European elite. But the European elite is absolutely non-independent. This elite is absolutely controllable. Do you think the appointment of Baltic politicians to key positions in the European Union was accidental? When an audit looms and someone must answer for all the theft and for the collapse of the governed body, a scapegoat is always needed. That's precisely why Baltic politicians have been chosen as the sacrificial lambs, those who will be publicly punished to instill fear and force the rest into submission, especially now when there are no independent leaders left within the European elite. And here's J.D. Vance arriving, but instead of meeting with Scholz, he meets with Merz and Alice Weidel. And what about Scholz? Vance's message is clear. Why would I meet with you? You won't be chancellor for much longer. By tomorrow, you'll be gone. We're the ones taking charge of governance. And in this regard, what truly matters is how the ice will break. Immediately, the president of Switzerland declares, I support Vance. Without delay, Rutte also voices his support for Vance. And off we go. This is, in fact, an objective process. Since the entire Western elite is non-independent, they are left with only one choice. Either they align themselves with Trump's agenda, or they will be removed from their positions. Poland grasped this reality faster than anyone, and the idea of building Fort Trump immediately resurfaced. This is how Trump is working to preserve his system.
Потому что санкции исключают Россию и другие государства из долларовой среды, а пошлины, они работают на то.
Instead of relying on sanctions, he is shifting toward tariffs. Because while sanctions push Russia and other countries out of the dollar-based economy, tariffs serve to strengthen the U.S. while economically weakening the tax country. This is precisely the strategy the United States employed throughout the 20th century. However, this approach is only effective if you are the world's hegemon. What is a tariff, after all? When you impose a tariff on a foreign product, it raises its price in your domestic market. If your domestic market lacks a cheaper domestically produced alternative, this directly impacts the well-being of your citizens. Today, the United States is practically deindustrialized. To reindustrialize, the United States has historically relied on tariffs. However, in the past, tariffs always impacted suppliers exporting goods to the United States.
Для того, чтобы эти товары были доступны населению Соединенных Штатов, поставщик, ну, например, Китай.
In other words, to keep their products affordable for American consumers, suppliers, such as China, absorb the cost by reducing profit margins, cutting workers' wages, or making other financial adjustments to stay profitable while continuing exports to the United States. The situation is fundamentally different now. The United States can no longer force anyone to trade at a loss. The collapse of the system is ongoing. That's why securing resources is so crucial for Trump at this moment. And if he manages to strike a deal with Russia, he always talks about deals. But why should the United States have any say in our relations with Ukraine, Russia's territory, now temporarily rebellious? Why should the United States have any stake in our relations with Germany or France? We are an independent state and must act as a sovereign one. Yes, our so-called elite is neither independent nor sovereign. Recently, one of our deputy ministers was even officially designated a foreign agent because, while holding office, he actively betrayed Russia's interests. And this was a deputy foreign minister. So, what is the West supposed to think when treason against Russia occurs at such a high level? So, what did Putin say about the negotiations? He made it clear that we must address the root causes of the crisis, and Ukraine is not the root cause of the crisis. The real root cause of the crisis is the collective West's aggression against Russia, particularly NATO's expansion eastward. That is the root cause of the crisis, and that is what we will discuss. Putin also stated that we will discuss the Ukrainian problematic. We are not going to debate whether Ukraine will exist as a state or not. That is none of their business. Whether Ukraine ultimately becomes part of Russia or remains in some other form for a time is not their concern. So, what exactly does the Ukrainian problematic refer to? The Ukrainian problematic refers to the involvement of foreign states in the war they are waging against Russia through Ukraine. That is the real Ukrainian problematic, a discussion about the policies of those states that dare to interfere in Russia's internal affairs. I repeat, we will not discuss Ukraine's future with anyone. That is for us to decide. What we will do is settle the issue with all the states that dare to interfere in Russia's internal affairs and violate Russia's territorial integrity, using these Ukrainian gangs as a tool. In this situation, dialogue must occur and negotiations must take place. Putin has already explained everything in sufficient detail. Basically,
полноценный государь.
Unlike Peskov, Putin is a conceptually powerful and fully sovereign go-suitor of Russia, pursuing a conceptually determined, sovereign, and independent policy for Russia.
И вот это понимает
This is something
Трамп
both Trump
и
and the supranational governance understand.
Они
They
понимают,
recognize
что
that
Россию
Russia
нужно победить.
cannot
А
simply be
значит,
crushed, which
сейчас
means that
нужно
at this stage,
договариваться с
negotiations
любыми
must take
здешними.
place
Да,
regardless of the
конечно, они
costs it
играют
entails.
в плохого и хорошего полицейского. Когда Келлог там, мы на Россию санкции наложим, мы там сделаем
Of
то,
course, they're playing the
России
classic good
прикажем
cop,
это,
bad
а
cop
вы,
routine, while
этот,
Kellogg
вы,
declares,
как он,
we will impose sanctions on Russia. We will do this. We will order Russia to do
говорит,
that. Witkoff counters with,
мы
we will
будем
negotiate.
договариваться,
We
мы
will seek a
будем искать
framework
формат
for
доверия.
trust.
И когда мы говорим о том, что не собираемся с Западом
And when we
никак
state
обсуждать
unequivocally that we have no intention of discussing Ukraine with the West in any way, Kellogg immediately retorts, the West will be at the negotiating table. But what business does the West have being there? First, we will settle our bilateral relations with the United States, and only then will we resolve the Ukrainian problematic with everyone else. No problem. If they refuse to engage, so be it. Russia will be a sovereign state again, no matter how desperately the pro-American lackey Russian elite tries to prevent it, with Elvira Sakipzadov and Abielina as their frontmen. So, they will achieve nothing. They don't understand that they are completely non-independent. They are slaves, they are mentally enslaved by the West. That's why they fail to grasp their master's moves. Meanwhile, the master fully understands that in order to preserve civilization on planet Earth, it is necessary to negotiate with Russia.
Пока что Россия еще в таком состоянии, когда она не может в полной мере.
For now, Russia is still in a state where it cannot yet fully and conceptually assert its domestic and foreign policies with absolute determinacy. So now is the time to negotiate with it. But Russia will not make concessions. That's why they were so desperate to remove Putin and install Medvedev, whose only dream was to lick foreign ass. And for that, he was willing to surrender Russia. Just recall the war of 888 and his Medvedev-Sarkozy format. It was only thanks to Putin that the genocide of the Ossetian people was prevented. Medvedev had already struck a deal. He betrayed our peacekeepers in an instant. Meanwhile, Sarkozy was in tears, pleading with Putin not to deploy soldiers, to give NATO time to organize and send its troops into the Caucasus, severing the region from Russia and kickstarting NATO's expansion there into the Caucasus. Medvedev was fully on board with this plan. By the way, there's a highly revealing documentary about these events, made in their immediate aftermath. That's the situation.
That's all for today.
Well then, all that remains is for me to say goodbye and remind you that many things are incomprehensible to us not because our minds are weak, but because these things do not fall within the circle of our concepts. In the past, being able to read, write, and count was enough to establish oneself as an educated person and a responsible citizen. Today, however, one must also understand how complex social supersystems, such as states, are governed. When you step onto the street without knowing the rules of the road, you risk being hit by a car or finding yourself in another dangerous, even catastrophic situation. But if you know the rules of the road, you can calmly avoid such dangers.
То вы всегда будете строить свою собственную жизнь таким образом, чтобы она...
Therefore, if you know how states are governed, you will always be able to build your own life in a way that minimizes the impact of crises caused by ineffective state governance.
И выстраивая свою жизнь, вы будете воздействовать на общие процессы.
Moreover, by building your life this way, You will also contribute to shaping broader state processes, steering them toward greater alignment with your aspirations for peace, prosperity, and a promising future. After all, only a strong state can ensure a peaceful and secure future for us and our children. However, the greatest problem of modern society is that people do not know how complex social supersystems are governed. Such knowledge is presented in only one source, the works of the internal predictor of the USSR. And for the current moment, for the situation we face today, we have already prepared in advance a 3-volume work titled War, State, Bolshevism. This work outlines the fundamental principles of state organization. What a state is, what an empire is, what a state constructor is, what an engineered state is, and what a historical state is. These topics are explored in detail in the first volume, State. The second volume, War, examines the methods of waging wars, including how the objectives of seizing foreign natural, energy, and human resources are achieved through non-military means. It explores the conduct of trade wars, Cold Wars, and, most significantly, how our invincible and legendary, having known the joy of victory in battle and beloved Red Army, suddenly collapsed without a single fight, brought down by betrayal. The bulk of the second volume is dedicated to how the West prepared for war against Russia and how preparations for the First World War began after the Patriotic War of 1812. Right now, the world is experiencing a serious and bloody cataclysm. Russia is being drenched in blood. That is why the third volume, Bolshevism, is dedicated to finding a way out of this bloody vortex. In Russia, the solution has always been found in the unique historical and cultural phenomenon of the Russian people, in Russian Bolshevism. Russian Bolshevism saved Russia during the time of troubles in the 17th century. It saved Russia during the time of troubles of the early 20th century. And it is Russian Bolshevism that is saving Russia now as the time of troubles of the early 21st century unfolds. It is precisely for this reason that all of Russia's enemies, from Hitler to the so-called Russian pro-American lackeys, regardless of what they call themselves, harbor such hatred for Russian Bolshevism and such love for fascism. But the ideologue of Russian fascism, Lenin, once said, "The Russian people are historically Bolshevik, and therefore we will not succeed in imposing fascism in Russia unless we change the culture of the Russian people." This is exactly why cultural wars are being waged, to reformat our people's culture in order to impose fascism and turn Russia into a raw material appendage of the West. The pro-American lackeys, the so-called Russ-Zion elite in Russia, have even established a state-funded propaganda center for fascism at a state university. And now, the war against fascism is in full swing. The Great Patriotic War continues, and on the battlefields of the Special Military Operation for Demilitarization and Denazification, our brothers are fighting for Russia's sovereignty, repelling fascist aggression. Meanwhile, the fascist pro-American lackey elites, the devotees of Lenin, are stabbing our army in the back. They dream of seeing Russia colonized, fascism imposed in Russia, and Russian culture eradicated altogether. For them, the people are simply not what they ought to be. For Lenin, the people were always the wrong kind, despite his self-proclaimed status as a great admirer of the Russian people. Let me repeat, for this bloody and turbulent period, both to understand it and to navigate it with minimal bloodshed. We have prepared the 3-volume work, War, State, Bolshevism. This is complemented by another work, State Symbols and State Sovereignty.
Вот как по обмундированию, знаком различия любого военнослужащего можно определить, к какому роду войск принадлежит военнослужащий, какой уровень он занимает в этих вооруженных силах.
Just as a serviceman's uniform and insignia reveal his branch and rank, a state's symbols, primarily its flag, reveal its nature, its place in the global hierarchy of states, and its capabilities. And once you understand this, the arguments of many political analysts will seem laughable, because simply by looking at a flag, you can immediately grasp a state's potential and its degree of subordination within global processes. I often say that Iran will become the center of governance concentration for the Euro-Asian wing of the global predictor, even though many focus solely on Iran's internal problems. After all, the center of governance concentration is being established in Iran precisely because Iran retains remnants of the imperial culture inherited from the Persian Empire. However, because its level of statehood remains weak, it has a corresponding flag. But once Iran gains potential, its flag will change accordingly. As a supplement to the 3-volume set, War, State, Bolshevism, our partners have published a collection of analytical notes titled Fleet is Being. These analytical notes, covering topics such as the Constitution of Russia, the Central Bank, the WTO, and other critical issues, will help you better understand the nature of our state's position in the modern world. In addition, our partners, along with the first and second editions of the book War, State, Bolshevism, have published an additional volume containing the materials that were later incorporated into the third edition, which is now available in print. Additionally, our partners are publishing a series of books titled The Library of Conceptual Knowledge. A volume on economics has been published, explaining how an economy should function and how to determine the role of each governing entity in the economic sphere. A volume on imitative and provocative activity has been published. Today, one of the major problems is that public opinion leaders often turn out to be different from who they claim to be. How can you tell whether the public opinion leader you trust is engaging with you honestly or attempting to deceive you and lead you astray? This is precisely why the collection on imitative and provocative activity was released. The third volume, Sufficiently General Theory of Governance, serves as the foundation of the conception of public safety. The next volume, Ida Pushkin, explores the conceptual depth of Pushkin's works. Next comes the volume, Matrix is Different from Matrix, which explores the application of matrix governance in complex social supersystems. Also, a book on how to live in a human way has been published. It delves into the true essence of Stalinism, what Stalinism really is beyond the myths propagated by the mass media, but rather the real Stalinism, as expressed both in actions and in its theoretical legacy. And the next volume, published by our partners, is a reissue of a collection of analytical notes from 1923 on world fascism. In other words, fascism was defined and theoretically developed as early as 1923. Yet today, when people attempt to theorize, saying, in Italy, this is fascism, while in Germany, it is National Socialism, and these are different things, the reality remains that both were manifestations of fascism, each adapted to national specificities. This becomes evident when reading the book, which was written even before the Nazis came to power in Germany. Even then, everything was clearly laid out in these analytical notes on world fascism. That is why our fathers and grandfathers knew exactly whom they were fighting against, which is why they refer to the enemy forces as German fascist rather than National Socialist. The term fascist signified the unification of all fascist forces around Germany. Read these and other works by the internal predictor of the USSR. Become conceptually powerful, defend your interests and those of your family, and through that, defend the interests of the state, ensuring future prosperity, a peaceful sky above your head, and happiness for yourself, your family, and your children. Goodbye. I'll see you next time.